Every few months, someone with a microphone and a large following tells you that the CBC is a billion-dollar waste of your money, that it's biased, that it's irrelevant, that the free market will fill the gap the moment we pull the plug.
The Sanity Project, where reason beats rage.
My name is David Mercer, and this is the Sanity Project, where we don't ask you to take anyone's word for anything. Today, we are going to look at the 5 most common arguments made by those calling for the CBC to be defunded. And then we are going to look at the actual evidence. Not talking points, not outrage, evidence. Because here is what the loudest voices in this debate are counting on, that you won't look it up. We looked it up. Argument 1. The bias claim. Let's start with the argument you have probably heard the most. The CBC is biased. According to its loudest critics, the national broadcaster has a systemic left-wing slant, a so-called woke agenda that shapes its coverage from top to bottom. And during the pandemic and the 2022 trucker convoy protests, they say the CBC didn't just report the news. They say it chose sides. Now, before we look at the evidence, let's be honest about something. Every single person who has ever watched the news has felt, at some point, that the coverage didn't reflect their reality. That feeling is real, but a feeling is not a fact. Here is what the evidence actually shows. The CBC operates under the Broadcasting Act, which legally requires it to provide, and I am quoting directly here, a balance of information and a range of opinion. It is not optional. It is the law. The CBC also maintains an independent ombudsman whose sole job is to investigate complaints of bias from the public. Anyone can file one. Conservatives, liberals, anyone. And they do, regularly. But here is what the critics never mention. In 2022, researchers at McGill University's Media Ecosystem Observatory analyzed thousands of CBC news segments. Their finding? CBC coverage of conservative politicians was, statistically, no more negative than its coverage of liberal politicians. Not meaningfully different. The bias was in the accusation, not in the broadcast. Does that mean the CBC is perfect? No. No news organization is. But imperfect and deliberately biased against conservatives are not the same thing. One is a criticism worth having. The other is a fundraising strategy. And the next time you hear that argument, it is worth asking who exactly benefits from you believing it. Argument 2. The cost. Now let's talk about money, because this is the argument that sounds the most reasonable on the surface. $1.4 billion. Every year. Of your money. Going to the CBC. That number is real and worth examining. But here is what the people quoting that number almost never tell you. Canada is the second largest country on Earth by landmass. We have 2 official languages. We have remote northern communities that no private broadcaster has ever chosen to serve. And we have roughly 40 million people spread across 8.5 million square kilometers and 6 time zones. $1.4 billion sounds enormous until you do the math. That works out to approximately $34 per Canadian per year. $34. That is less than a single month of a basic streaming subscription, and it funds a national broadcaster that serves every province, territory, and official language in the country. Now let's compare that to our closest cultural cousins. The BBC costs the average UK household £169 per year. That is roughly 290 Canadian dollars. Per household. Not per country. Per household. So the next time someone tells you the CBC is a billion-dollar boondoggle, ask them what they think the alternative actually costs, because the receipt does not lie. Argument 3. The free market will fill the gap. The third argument is the one that sounds the most modern. We don't need the CBC anymore. The free market will fill the gap. Netflix exists, podcasts exist, YouTube exists. Just let it go. It is a seductive argument. And if you live in a major urban center with high-speed internet and disposable income, it almost makes sense. Almost. Here is what actually happens when public broadcasting pulls back and the market is left to decide. When the market decides what gets covered, it covers what makes money. Between 2010 and 2023, Canada lost over 400 local news outlets. Not because Canadians stopped caring about local news, but because local news in a small community is not profitable enough for a shareholder. Post Media, one of Canada's largest private media companies, has closed or merged dozens of local papers across the country. Not because those communities didn't need them, but because the numbers didn't work. And in those communities, the free market never stepped in. When CTV shut down its local Windsor newscast in 2023, the CBC Windsor Bureau was still there. When private radio stations automated their programming and eliminated local hosts, CBC Radio kept its regional morning shows running. The free market is very good at many things. Serving unprofitable communities in a country the size of a continent is not one of them. That is not an opinion. That is a business model. The American example. Some of you may be thinking, fine, maybe the free market isn't perfect for small Canadian communities, but surely competition produces better, more independent journalism overall. After all, look at the United States. Hundreds of channels, thousands of outlets, the biggest media ecosystem on Earth. In 1983, 50 independent companies controlled 90% of American media. 50. Today, that same 90% is controlled by just 5 corporations. 5 corporations deciding what 230 million American news consumers see, hear, and read. And who owns those corporations? Billionaires. With very specific political and financial interests. Rupert Murdoch owns Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Post simultaneously. One man. 3 of the most influential outlets in the English-speaking world. That is not a free market. That is a monopoly with a media pass. In 2018, the Sinclair Broadcast Group, the largest local television broadcaster in the United States, sent a single script to anchors at nearly 200 local stations across the country. Nearly 200 stations, all reading word for word the same corporate-approved message. These were local anchors, trusted faces, people whom viewers believed were reporting on their own communities, and they were all reading from the same page, literally. Now ask yourself, is that what independent journalism looks like? Because here is what that system has produced on the ground. More than half of all counties in the United States are now what researchers call news deserts. No local paper. No local TV coverage. No one is covering City Hall. No one is covering the school board. No one is asking questions on behalf of the community. 50 million Americans live in places where no one is left to report the news. That is the free market solution to journalism. Not more voices, fewer. Not more accountability, less. When the profit motive is the only motive, communities that cannot generate profit simply disappear from the news. Canada has watched this happen across the border for 30 years, and some of our loudest political voices want us to copy that model. The receipt is right there. We just have to be willing to look at it. Argument 4. CBC is government propaganda. The fourth argument is the one that cuts the deepest. The CBC is just government propaganda. If Ottawa funds it, Ottawa controls it. And a broadcaster that answers to the government cannot be trusted to hold the government accountable. It sounds logical. So let's look at it honestly. The CBC is funded by the federal government. That is true. But it is governed by an independent board of directors and operates under an editorial firewall that legally prohibits government interference in its journalism. That firewall has been tested. The CBC has investigated and reported critically on liberal, conservative, and municipal governments, police forces, and crown corporations. It broke the Mike Duffy Senate expense scandal. It exposed the disaster of the Phoenix pay system. It has reported critically on every sitting prime minister in living memory. State propaganda does not investigate the state. Real propaganda protects power, it does not challenge it. Argument 5. Nobody watches anymore. And the final argument, the one we hear more and more from younger critics, is simply this. Nobody watches the CBC anymore. Streaming is the future. Traditional broadcasting is dying. So why fund a relic? Here are the numbers. CBC digital properties, including CBC.ca and the CBC News app, reach over 17 million unique Canadians every month. 17 million. In a country of 40 million people. CBC Radio 1 reaches over 10 million Canadians every single week. The CBC is not dying. It is adapting to a digital world, meeting Canadians where they actually are. And there is a significant difference between adapting and becoming irrelevant. 5 arguments. 5 receipts. Here is what the evidence actually shows. The bias claim does not survive peer-reviewed scrutiny. The cost argument falls apart the moment you do the math. The free market alternative has already failed hundreds of Canadian communities. The propaganda accusation contradicts decades of the CBC's own journalism. The American example shows us, in real time, exactly what happens when media ownership concentrates in the hands of a few powerful interests. And the relevance question is answered by 17 million Canadians every single month. None of that means the CBC is beyond criticism. It isn't. No institution of that size and with that level of public trust should be above scrutiny. But there is a meaningful difference between honest, constructive criticism and a coordinated campaign to eliminate one of the last publicly accountable news institutions Canadians have. The difference between holding power accountable and handing power over. That is why this channel exists. And that is what we will keep doing, one receipt at a time. If you found this useful, share it with someone who has heard these arguments and didn't have the receipts to answer them. Subscribe to the Sanity Project, because the noise isn't getting quieter, and someone has to keep looking things up. I'm David Mercer. Thank you for being the kind of Canadian who still wants to know what is actually true. That matters more than you might think. We will see you next time.
If you want more facts and less fear, hit subscribe. Check out the next breakdown wherever you're listening or watching. Stay sane, Canada.